So, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this discussion that we are hosting this morning at the Observer Research Foundation on a painstaking and rather comprehensive paper written by Gautam Chikramane, my colleague at ORF, and Rishi Agarwal, co founder and CEO of Team Lee's RecTech. A paper that we must all engage with, a paper that certainly scared me. The contours of the paper made me realize that academia is a better choice than doing business in this country. It's dangerous being a businessman. This paper, which outlines unique compliances, 69,000 odd unique compliances that regulate business in India, of which 26,000 odd compliances have imprisonment clauses as penalty for non-compliance. This is not a regulatory ecosystem that is conducive to a country that wants to unleash its young energy and create value for folks, for communities, and for the country. 5 states have more than 1,000 imprisonment clauses in their business laws, and other states are not far behind. Business compliances are especially burdensome on SMEs and MSMEs. A typical small enterprise with more than 150 employees faces 500 to 900 compliances in a single year. The time has come to rethink India's business regulatory framework. But more importantly, it is time to reset the relationship between the state and businesses. Amongst the most dangerous of populist rhetorics that have hurt this country, I would argue the one that demonizes businesses and business people is most harmful. The rhetoric is both jaded and dangerous. It is jaded because young people in India seek to partake in prosperity and in creating value for their country, for their community, and for themselves. It is dangerous because this rhetoric perpetuates the mosaic of compliances and regulations that make doing business a near criminal endeavor. In recent years, the government has consigned many laws and regulations to footnotes of our economic history. And I hope that this effort by Gautam and Rishi will help policymakers do away with many more. As India heads towards becoming the world's third largest economy in the coming decade, it is critical that we cut this regulatory cholesterol, a term that the authors frame, and transform India's business climate. Inclusive growth is not about curtailing businesses, it is about building more businesses. We require a new cohort of businesses to partake in our economic futures, and therefore, this regulatory ecosystem needs a new rethink. The authors suggest that we use criminal penalties with restraint, far greater restraint than is currently the case. They argue that it is important to remove criminality from procedural lapses and inadvertent omissions. They also suggest that we must ensure there is imprisonment for willful transgressions, loss of life, environmental destruction, tax evasion, and other such activities. They also suggest sunset clauses. Some of these compliances need to fade away over time in an enterprise's life. And finally, they suggest what many have suggested earlier of ushering all of these measures under an overarching single legislation that seeks to promote business in the country. But most importantly, my takeaway from this report is their attempt to infuse dignity to to professionals, to entrepreneurs, to business persons, and to wealth creators. It is perhaps time to start reappraising these folks who are creating value for the country. And I think this is the single biggest takeaway for me from the report on our assessment of those who build value for us. And I think this a very exciting panel that has been put together to discuss this very important piece of work that I'm sure will agitate many of us in the months ahead is going to be curated and moderated by my colleague, Professor Shamika Ravi. And with that, let me hand it over to Professor Ravi, who will introduce our guest this morning and engage with the authors and the panelists to discuss this very, very important question that all of us must try to find answers to. Shamika, over to you.
Thank you, Samir. Jailed for doing business. Well, as the title of the book pretty much very clearly lays out, it is a very difficult terrain that businesses and entrepreneurs across India have had to traverse over the last several decades. But let me start out by first talking about a very influential research that was published in the Journal of Political Economy in 2006, very highly cited, which went on to show empirically with data that corruption in a country can actually be explained by culture. So it's a typical cross country analysis where the authors use culture as an explanation for why corruption exists. Now, for an Indian and an economist and an empiricist like me, it was deeply offensive, I would say even racist, because culture is a lazy argument. From a public policy perspective, if we delegate an outcome to culture, it's like a black box. There's very little one can do. And yet, in policy research, or in terms of thinking of ways in which one can improve the governance in a country, one is often thinking about what can be done to improve the situation. So when we started to look at the data, which is frankly the only thing we can do as scholars, researchers, we found a very important index in the gamut of indices which are typically used in doing cross-country regressions, called the Government Effectiveness Index, which basically looks at laws in the country. It looks at the quality of bureaucracy, of public services, the amount and quality of infrastructure. And quite intuitively, these things begin to appeal to the senses. So we ran the same set of analysis that the JP article did with government effectiveness thrown in as an additional index. Not very surprising. Government effectiveness pretty much overshadows and drives culture out of the picture. In fact, in almost all the regression analysis, culture became insignificant and in some cases also reversed the results. Now, this was a paper published in 2009, but what I'm really glad about is today my colleagues and friends from TeamLease have gone on to put a microscope to government effectiveness, which is laws and criminal laws in particular, which govern doing business in India. So from that perspective, I'm very excited that really it is extending our understanding of why corruption exists, why inefficiency exists. But what these authors have gone on to do, quite noteworthy, I think their contribution to policy world is in terms of highlighting exactly what needs to be done to dismantle what is currently a tyranny without a tyrant. Having bad laws have curtailed economic activities in India in many ways than one can count. And while they will be using terms such as over-criminalization of employment or of employers, it's really because most of these laws, and in terms of the number of people who are affected, really rests within the labor laws. So while we will keep our large part of conversation on labor laws, but clearly there are many more areas of business which are impacted by such over-criminalization. This book, this draft, I request all of you who are signed in and those of you who will watch this later, pick a copy of this book. It truly presents a blueprint of how to move forward. So this is a highly recommended text for all of you who are interested in building a modern economy in the country. So I'm very excited to invite the authors, Gautam and Rishi, who will have the initial 10 minutes, and then we go to Neeti and Manish as discussants. So Gautam, can I start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Shamika. I love this expression that you have used and context our research with a tyranny without a tyrant. It's beautiful. And I think it captures the essence in a very elegant manner. That said, I think you are no less a tyrant by giving us only 5 minutes each, while we have much more to say. And so I'm going to try and function within my time limit. So here is a brief window into India's business regulatory universe. There are 1,536 laws, half of which carry imprisonment clauses. There are 69,233 compliance requirements on business at an aggregate every year, 2 out of 5 of which carry imprisonment clauses. Most of these imprisonment clauses, 42%, which means 2 out of 5, are for between 1 and 3 years. To illustrate what that means, this is 42% of these compliances carry jail terms which are equivalent to sedition. I can go on, but I'm treating the monograph as read, and there are many points I want to make, but again, the tyranny of Shamika Ravi prevents me to and restricts me to just 3. First, I want you to visualize intellectually what these clauses are. A jail term for acts of sedition under the Indian Penal Code is the same for not whitewashing latrines and urinals once in 4 months under the Factories Act 1948 and related rules. Assault or the use of criminal force on women with the intent to disrobe under IPC attracts the same imprisonment term as for not furnishing monthly details of inward supplies in Form GSTR2 under the Goods and Services Act 2017. Collecting arms with the intention of waging a war against the Indian government under IPC is punishable with the same jail term as for not displaying stock and price of liquefied petroleum gas at a conspicuous place of business under the Essential Commodities Act 1955 and related rules. When I say related rules, those are the state rules. The base act is a union act. This has been the economic policy making context over the past 7 decades. Even today, in the middle of 5 state elections, we hear speeches that demonize those who take risks with their money, who establish companies, who create jobs, value, wealth, pay taxes. They weep, they cry for small businesses. They weep for MSMEs. Well, here are some more numbers. An MSME in India can be inspected by as many as 20 inspectors at any time, which means you're doing your business. Any inspector can walk in and inspect your books, your boiler, your floor, your spittoons. Out of 63 million enterprises in India, only 1 million are in the formal space. More than 90% of the Indian employers stay small by choice. The moment an entrepreneur aspires for growth and he or she, his or her company raises its head to expand the scale and become part of the formal economy, it can lead to more than 400 compliances a year that become applicable as soon as it is formalized overnight. Much easier to set up a series of 2 or 3 or 5 small units than go formal. My second point. On the other side, we see India's aspiration to be a $10 trillion economy in 15 years. This will not happen by default. A $3 trillion economy that is expected to be the world's 3rd largest within this decade will not happen on the institutional framework of the past. It will need prayas, effort. The policy focus of that prayas is compliance reforms. Today, we are seeing the rise of startups. There were more than 14,000 new startups in 2021 alone compared to 733 in 2017. Startups now have a technical definition under the government. Cumulatively, there are more than 61,000 startups in India today. Their geographical reach is deeper. In 2016 and 17, there were 121 districts with at least one startup. In 2021, that number is 555. Startups need to be encouraged, not smothered by the Inspector Raj. My third point, after looking at the paper and reviewing it myself, and when we step back, what I see is what the JAM Trinity did for financial inclusion as the last mile effectivity, what UPI has done for payments, compliance reforms will do for doing business. We believe that India's 3rd generation reforms will be in the compliance space, and this report gives the government, parliament, and state legislatures an agenda to initiate these reforms. We can discuss this later. When I step back, I see a concerted effort to keep India poor and bureaucrats rich, to abuse entrepreneurs for rent seeking, which is now clearly visible in the research that we have done, in the laws that we have enacted. The license Raj may have ended, but the Inspector Raj continues. It is through the presence of such imprisonment clauses that an inspector derives his power, his authority. You may say that very few business persons have been jailed, and you could be right. That data doesn't exist. I would turn the question around. If there is a law and if businesses are in breach, why are they not in jail? Corruption? Bribery? Favor mongering through jobs for relatives? I don't know. These petty extortion rackets will continue. But what bogs my mind and what should bother every alert citizen in India is, why has the political class succumbed to this? It could be leaderships of the past, it could be ideology, it could be virtue signaling, it could be the Maibap being the Maibap by keeping the poor poor. It has to end. Back to you, Shamika.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you for those very forceful opening remarks. Rishi, if I may come to you, please.
Sure, Shamika. Thank you so much. Gautam has already introduced some basic numbers. Let me dissect them further. At Team Lee's RegTech over the last few years, over 50 lawyers have spent time trying to peel this onion, get into the detail, because devil is in the detail, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. To be precise, 843 out of 1,536 laws in India have clauses for imprisonment. 599 of them have, which is a whopping 71%, are with the states. These 599 acts have over 20,000 provisions, which account for at least 80% of the total criminality in India's business laws. What that tells us is the effort at the center is important, but what is more important, what is more critical, is the effort by the states. States will have to pick up the baton and run with this. Let's peel this onion further. Jail term that is prescribed in the Indian law ranges between 3 and 10 years. 86% of this jail term is from 3 months to 3 years, 0 to 3 years basically. The other 14% can take up to 10 years. Labor as a category comprises only 30% in terms of acts, 47% in terms of compliances, but when you look at the criminality contribution, guess what? It's 68%. So you can see there is a disproportionate amount of criminality from the labor laws. This also tells us that if we do a good job of the codification, not just at the center level, but at the states as well, we probably have a good chance of addressing this problem to some extent. Now, let's dive deeper within labor laws. Factories Act of 1948 is the biggest culprit. The Factories Act 1948 and the related rules, they account for 31% of all the criminality among the 26,134 items that we have talked about in the report. That means every 1 in 3 items that has clauses for imprisonment is from the Factories Act. No wonder the contribution of manufacturing to our GDP has been so low. If we are serious about creating manufacturing jobs over the next decade, we really need to review this hostility and distrust, which is so deeply ingrained into our Factories Act. Let's take some examples. Our Factories Act have microscopic prescriptions. Some examples: provisioning of canteens, restrooms, washing areas, urinals, latrines, displaying of the wage notice, cleaning of the floor of the workmen at least once a week, providing adequate number of spittoons. These are examples. Contraventions of these could lead to an imprisonment of up to 3 months. Let's take some more examples. Displaying of the abstract of Payment of Wages Act, displaying the abstract of Maternity Benefit Act, notice showing date of payment of wages, maintaining tables, chairs, and benches in the canteen. Some of these, the contraventions, the infractions, the breaches, can put you in jail for about 1 year. If you see some of these examples, you'll notice that a lot of them are procedural compliances. A lot of them are extremely prescriptive. The question is whether in the 21st century, Indian entrepreneurs need such microscopic oversight on the provision of spittoons, gender segregated washrooms, places for storage of clothing, and painting of the inner walls of canteens. Can we afford to send our job creators to jail for failing to display the abstract of an act? Can these offenses be seen as grave enough to deserve a punishment as strong as a jail term? Do these infractions or contraventions stand the acid test of necessity, proportionality, and they are in conformance with the foundational principles of the criminal justice system? Most of these laws were created in the colonial era, but the times have changed. Today's factories employ robotics, IoT devices, and a lot of technology. We are talking about ushering India's manufacturing into Industry 4.0. The question is whether our regulatory environment, the regulatory framework, has kept pace with the new reality and new needs of the new India. That is where we make a case to reimagine India's employer compliance, which becomes supportive, not hostile, which provides dignity to job creators and employers and not looks down upon them. That's where I address my case. Shamika, over to you.
Thank you, Rishi. Thank you for those detailing, and we will come back for more later. Now, I request the discussants, and I start with Dr. Neeti Shikha from the Indian School of Public Policy. Neeti, your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Shamika. Let me begin congratulating Gautam and Rishi for the wonderful report and ORF for taking this initiative. As I see the report and as I read, I think it is one of the finest reports that country has produced. As India rewrites its economic philosophy, it is extremely important that we relook into how we look at the regulatory philosophy of the country. Coming from the Nehruvian era, we have always seen business as antithetic to citizen welfare, and probably it's time to reconsider how we look at businesses. It's interesting to note that Constitution of India allows every citizen to do business and trade freely. But how free is a citizen is a question that I think we need to discuss today. Uh, Interestingly, if you look at the law, one of the cardinal principles of law is that laws must be certain. And why certain? Because any investor who's coming to India has to be sure what the legal risk he's taking and what the outcome would be. And not just the investors who are foreign, but also the Indian investors. Now, interestingly, as Rishi and Gautam pointed out, there are several laws that sit on our statute book. Those laws may be used, abused, misused, or sometimes not even used. But the fact that they lie on the statute book creates a lot of uncertainty and scope for people. And as Gautam pointed out, some bureaucracy, scope for bureaucracy to abuse these laws and use it against the interests of traders. Second question that we need to mull over and very seriously is, are the courts in India capacitated well enough to look at the burden that criminal justice system has been bestowed with under these statutes? India is as such plaguing with huge case backlogs, and criminal justice system as such needs an overhaul. Now, there's a cardinal principle in law which says that we all must endeavor to put an end to litigation. This principle has been so well adopted by various countries. You look at America, you look at UK, but in India, we have not been able to catch up with the speed. Now, if we want to design a regulatory framework which allows courts to function well, we have to make sure that ways and means should be such that tries to put an end to litigation. Now, having these laws, as I said, used, abused, misused, or never used on the statute book does not allow that. Now, there's a very interesting study, Shamika, I'd like to quote here. There's a 3-year long survey done in South Africa, which found that 74% of businesses in South Africa closed down because of over-regulation. Now, India has to learn from the experiences of its friends, and we have to design a framework which supports its citizens to do business. Interestingly, the narrative that has been created in past, business soot boot ki sarkar. This is something which government should not be, get dissuaded with. And we have to think of the new India as we imagine for our children and children's children. And for that, to have that kind of welfare, we need to co-create value. And for the co-creation of value, it's extremely important that businesses are seen not with the eyes of suspicion, but rather eyes of trust. And for that, laws really need to overhaul, and we need to recreate the regulatory philosophy. And I'm so glad that the conversation has started, and I'm certain that there'll be many takers of this report and who will take the discussion forward. With that, let me pause and give the stage back to you, Shamika. Thank you.
Thank you, Niti. And that finally brings me to one of the strongest advocates, one of the strongest voices, which has been calling for improvements and reforms in our business climate with specific focus on labor laws. I've been seeing Manish Sabarbal's writings over the last 20 years on these set of issues. So, Manish, your 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Shamika. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here. I think that the battle for ideas, which is being fought, is there an echo here?
You good?
Okay, I can't. I'm getting an echo. So essentially the battle for ideas, which needs to be fought, is really a tough one. In a poor country, I can intuitively understand the attractiveness of there being villains, and the villains obviously being business. And over the years, we've tried to make the case that. The private sector has a trust deficit, the government has an execution deficit, and nonprofits have a scale deficit. And but nobody's going to solve India's problems alone. And unless we learn how to work together, we have our own swim lanes, and we get rid of this stupid tug of war metaphor, where one person is going to have to win and the other is going to lose. We move to a dance metaphor where all three people come together. And I think that is challenged by the burden of history. The 1955 Avadi Resolution or the 1956 Second Five-Year Plan really mean today our capital is handicapped without labor and our labor is handicapped without capital. And today's report about decriminalization is obviously, as Gandhiji would say, one leg of the elephant, right? I mean, it clearly captures a very important part of India's business ecosystem, but it is easy to anticipate the response of why does this matter, and Gautam covered some of that. But it's also important to think about where does this come from. I think it matters a lot. The transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced are not an efficient way for either the government or the private sector to do business or to create jobs. And essentially, as Gautam pointed out, that if these laws are not enforced, why are they not? And essentially, it is the source or the fountainhead of corruption is the ability to threaten somebody with bodily harm. I mean, we obviously don't have that many CEOs in jail as these laws would make us think. So I would say that the most important cost of the Indian economy is corruption. The second one is on productivity. I think that poverty is about productivity, and formalization is the only path to more productive employers. We have 63 million enterprises. We only have 23,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. And so I think the notion of our problem being jobs is delusional. Our problem is employed poverty, right? It is wages, and wages depend on the productivity of firms. And this kind of regulatory cholesterol really reduces the formalization of the economy and formal jobs. But I think the justice points which Niti brought up are really important. There was an interesting visit by B.N. Rao, who was one of the drafters of the Constitution, to the US in the early 1940s. And US Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter told him, don't put a due process clause in your constitution. Substitute it with procedure established by law. Now, that's a really interesting, small, subtle difference, because all these criminal provisions are established by law, but they violate due process. And I think it's important for us to think about justice. Where does this come from? It obviously comes from legislative neglect. Bureaucrats can propose what they want, but legislators should reject it. I think courts have viewed the law or how much punishment there should be as the role of the executive or the legislature. But I think the notion of criminal provisions being harm to others, which many academics propose, is an important sort of heuristic to use, if anything else. And obviously, it comes from self-interest of 25 million bureaucrats. We tend to think of 4,732 IAS officers, but India's civil service would be the 50th largest country in the world. There are 25 million of them. They use this as a weapon every day to make the life miserable. So the notion that an imandar is considered a bewakoof in India is really one of the reasons why we are poor. And I think that sort of moving from deals to rules, thinking about the three deficits, and just thinking of ease of doing business as not making life is easy for the Birlas, Tatas, HDFC, or Infosys, or people like us. I have 130 guys in regulatory affairs. This regulatory cholesterol is a cost for me. It's a thorn in the flesh. It's not a dagger in the heart. But for small companies, this regulatory cholesterol is a dagger in the heart. It's not a thorn in the flesh because they don't know how to deal with it. So I think it's a unique time in India. You know, the next 25 years are going to be totally unlike the last 25 years. 50% of India's FDI since 1991 came in the last 5 years. It looks like China, Xi Jinping has made a list of everything Deng Xiaoping did right, and he's crossing it off. So he's making India a lot more attractive than it used to be anyway. And I think with the global glut of capital, we're the only large country in the world with 25 years of high growth ahead of us. So there's no question that, when I landed in the US for my MBA in August 1994, there was a front page article on Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which she wrote that, because what's happening in India is not once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's once in the lifetime of a country. And today's paper by Gautam and Rishi is a massive contribution to the actionable battle for ideas. A lot of people like to fight the battle for ideas by describing the world rather than changing it. And I think that these two have put together a paper which really is specific, it's finite, and it's actionable. And so it's a wonderful contribution to policy.
Thank you, Manish. So now we come back to the authors. As Manish highlighted, clearly a lot of these reforms that you are talking about is also about enforcing basic rule of law, taking away a lot of discretion away. Simpler the laws, the better they are. And clearly, in terms of curtailment, the threat and the fear works as a disincentive, which is what Gautam alluded to, that there's a reason firms are not growing beyond a certain scale. They would much rather be fragmented smaller firms. So we know there are diseconomies of scale, so on and so forth. But I wanted to bring in, and I wanted to question you about the timing of this. Why, of course, better late than never, but why it is such an urgency? Because our window of opportunity is not infinite. As a country, if you particularly look from the labor condition, the median age is 28. We are a young country, but we are a fast aging country as well. So in terms of labor productivity and just that window of opportunity available so that we can grow and employ and create wealth and so on and so forth. From the report, Gautam and Rishi, I'll leave it to either of you to address this. Can we highlight what the urgency of these reforms is? Because we don't want to lie back again. We know what the bottlenecks are. Legislative capacity could be, whatever the incentives, bureaucracy. But clearly, we have lots of bad laws, not just limited to business. But from the growth perspective, given that we are a low middle income country, could you give us a sense of how urgent these reforms ought to be from India's modern growth story? Gautam, if I may come to you, and then Rishi, come to you.
Yeah, I think the policy focus on growth, which began in 1991 with the industrial policy, Statement on Industrial Policy 1991, began to taper off as politics and bureaucracy began to realize the implication of growth meaning a dissolution of power. One by one, we got new regulators so that power got shifted away from the government to regulators. We saw the reduction of the license Raj, almost the end of license Raj. Inspector Raj, however, continues. That growth, somehow we got the growth, and then, how should I put it? The low-hanging fruits of the 1991 reforms are now behind us. To give you a context, China began its growth journey around the same time, and look where it is. It's 5 times larger than India. Now, it might sound a little political, but I'm being very factual. I think under Narendra Modi, we are beginning to see growth, not only growth back, or the policy focus on growth return. We are also seeing him as the leader of India, as the Prime Minister of India, stepping out and saying, bringing dignity to entrepreneurs. He prides in talking about startups. He takes pride in talking about wealth creators. He takes pride in talking about job creation. And I think so there is one aspect that you mentioned, that our demographic, basically the age advantage may go away. Concurrently, we have a leadership that is looking at growth. It wants growth. It seeks to build. When you put all these together, I think, although that was not the intention, we did a blank research. I'll talk about that later if you allow me. But I think our research somehow gets timed into or joins this larger wave, larger, how should I put it, the movement of a nation in which talks about growth, which wants prosperity, which wants to be wealthy, which wants to, it's going to be the third largest economy within this decade, but on one of the lowest per capita incomes. So I think that hunger, economic hunger at a policy level, we can see it play out. I'm quite disappointed with the way some parties are continue to abuse entrepreneurs, knowing fully well your future lies in more entrepreneurs coming and giving jobs, as Manish just mentioned. People need jobs. We keep talking about farmer, but finally that farmer has to move from farm labor, or farmer has to move from agriculture to industry, and then from industry to services. This industry part somehow is missing. Our research tells you why. We also keep groaning about, India has missed the manufacturing bus. Well, that's not true. The manufacturing that's happened in the last 15 years, double of that is going to happen in the next 15 years. So it is not a question of, as Rakesh Mohan once pointed out, it's not that we have missed the manufacturing bus. It's like we never got on. It came, it waited, and it moved on. And I think now that may change. Why, as Samir mentioned, would any entrepreneur put his money at risk? Why would he take such risks with labor? Why would he take such risks with capital, regulation, all these minute, looking at spittoons, looking at urinals, cleaning them? Why would he do that? So these laws, what we have given is a blueprint. We have given some recommendations how to change them. We have sought that a law commission be placed to look into each of these clauses and move forward. I think the country is ready. I think our entrepreneurs are ready. Most important, the next generation is ready. As I mentioned, there are startups in every district today. That yearning for growth, that hunger, that aspiration is all there. All we now need is a regulatory mechanism that enables doing business rather than curtails it.
Thank you, Gautam. Before I come to you, Rishi, Manish, Gautam mentioned the level of scrutiny. And I want you to think about it, and I'll come back to you. Is the level of scrutiny a problem, or is the criminalization of it a bigger problem? So just think about it. In the meantime, Rishi, an extension to the initial question to Gautam, and this has come from Sumit. Is the government doing anything to reduce or remove these compliance burdens?
So, Shamika, this is probably the best time we have a chance at reforming this space. Last 5 years, we have seen several attempts. The word ease of doing business has become a regular one in our parlance across the country. Finance Minister just spoke about ease of doing business 2.0. Prime Minister announced on 15th August from the ramparts of Red Fort his intent to curtail number of compliances. So clearly there is a political will. Government wants to do stuff. But as they say, hope is not a strategy. Devil lies in the detail. Nobody seems to have the detail. And when Gautam and I started talking, we thought if we can go into the detail, find the devil, and support government's intent, provide actionable items that can help refine the reform agenda, it would be a great help. And that was the original intent. But I think there is a political intent. They're all aligned. Everybody wants to do stuff, but most of the people don't know the details in the devil, which is where we focused on.
Thank you. Also, as the finance minister in this year's budget, and I think she also did it last year, she did mention how many on a daily basis laws are getting improved. So I think while I'm obviously not the specialist, I don't recall what number she mentioned, but it was significant. And I think it might be worthwhile looking into what changes are being brought about, even as we speak. So Manish, going back to the scrutiny and the detailed scrutiny, or is the criminalization which is a bigger concern? And the reason I ask this, Manish, I find it non-trivial, is because look, we are a developing country. We have many parts of the market which are highly underdeveloped and broken. We do have quite a large problem of employment, which means we do have excess labor. Now, given all of these, work conditions, workplace conditions, minimum wages. Now, one can talk about when should we be thinking about this, at what level of growth, and so on and so forth. But these are concerns. And in a country which aspires to be a modern economy and one of the leading sort of engines of global growth, we should be looking at those things. So what do you think is a bigger problem? Is the level of scrutiny and therefore giving too much heft to the inspector a problem, or giving a bigger stick to the inspector to put you behind jail, which is a bigger concern in your in your thinking?
I mean, I think that we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't upfront acknowledge that we don't live in an economy, we live in a society. I think everybody who's worked on this has always made the case that if the absence of laws made places entrepreneurial hotspots, then Waziristan in Pakistan or Swat Valley in Afghanistan would be hotbeds of venture capital and entrepreneurial activity. I think that there is nobody's case here that the private sector should not be subject to supervision. We are overregulated and under-supervised. That has been true in many situations. But the supervision, in what we mean by supervision, has to move to technology-based supervision. It has to be less invasive. I mean, I think the tax compliance, the tax to GDP ratio in this country should go up to 25, 30%. But it should not go up by raids like VP Singh thought he would take the tax to GDP ratio out. It should go out by sophisticated data warehouses that catch people who have incomes but don't pay taxes. So I think that the Indian economy is getting to the point where we must have some jail provisions in our employer compliances, but they should be for the non-negotiables. If you make everything non-negotiable, then if everybody loves everybody, then nobody loves anybody. And so it's just, the reality is, so I think that in the criminalization, the excessiveness is the point that is important. But in regulatory cholesterol, we also have to be clear that, a chief labor inspector of India has often told me, I am trying to enforce the unenforceable. And I think that, giving civil servants a job to enforce the unenforceable, even if they are honest, is a fool's errand. So I think the criminalization is excessive, but the regulatory cholesterol philosophy needs to move and shift in ways that hold the private sector accountable, but don't blunt its vitality and its energy and its entrepreneurship. And the most important thing is the mental model that a private sector employer is HDFC, Infosys, or the Tatas. Most employers in India are small. Most employers in India cannot handle the level of regulatory cholesterol that has been prescribed.
Excellent. Niti, there's a question for you from somebody, Mehek, in the audience. Since you mentioned South Africa, and that was a very hard-hitting statistic when you mentioned that 70% do shut down because of regulatory burden. The question is, which countries can one really look upon? A very quick answer would be nice, because we can't look at India. Well, India is very peculiar in every way, but we do want to think of a country which has managed this balance in terms of having good regulatory sort of a framework and managing to grow despite that. So any that come to your mind?
Yeah, there are a few, but let me quote the country where I started working as a lawyer. I began my journey as a lawyer. Shamika, when I was working in London in 2008, I remember it would take 1 day to start a business. I'm talking about 2008. India has achieved that just a few years back. UK is one of the excellent example of that. And why? Because in the judicial system, in judicial philosophy, it is ingrained that UK has to remain as attractive destination for commerce. So everything that is to do with the commerce is, it moves around that. And just to quickly make one point here, that we have to understand that law does not give excuse for ignorance, which means, if you're not aware of the law, does not issue you from the obligations under the law. So that's why it's extremely important that laws are clear, laws are certain. And yeah, if you look at UK is a good example. US, Manish talked about not doing away with jail provisions. I'll go back to US and look at it. I mean, there are certain international treaties that India has signed under which you cannot just completely do away with decriminalization of some of the corporate offenses, for example, money laundering. And US has adopted a very interesting approach to criminalize those severe acts, such as money laundering, inside trading, and other small compliances are compounded. So these are the two countries.
Great. Thank you. Now, here's a question to each of you, and I will come to you, Gautam, first, and we'll go to Rishi, Manish, and then Neeti. Now, this is a question that basically goes back to the point that Manish made: we don't live in an economy. And to that, it's a little bit, we are preaching to the choir here, because we are all looking at the economy and future growth of India from a particular lens, which is, of course, excessive criminalization, and we all agree on this. But this is a larger case that has to be made, and it has to be sold in terms of an idea. Now, the question which repeatedly is raised in political circuits, and you can see this also, and it's not just the political left. I think India does have a very socialist outlook, the entire spectrum. The question is, and this is again from Mehak, how can businesses be made easier for small-scale entrepreneurs while still holding large-scale entrepreneurs responsible and accountable? Is unrestrained wealth creation ethical if it leads to greater economic divide? Meaning, I mean, this is going back to what Manish said, that for him it's a thorn, not a dagger in the heart. But for the smaller businesses, it can become quite existential. So from a equity perspective, do you think, my belief is, of course, laws are laws, they'll help everyone grow. But I want you as specialists who are thinking of these set of issues to tell us that what you are recommending, will it have different implications for large firms vis-a-vis small firms? Will it lead to worsening of the inequality? Gautam?
This inequality question, while being an important point socially, it irritates me economically. The person who puts risk capital on the table has a 50% chance of losing. What 50%? Out of 10 startups that begin a business, 9 fail. That number is now, the failure rate in India today is 18.7%. However, in general and the long-term trends, out of 10, 9 fail or disappear and 1 becomes successful. We keep talking about that 1, which becomes a unicorn or a multi-unicorn or gets taken over by Microsoft or gets taken over by this company and that company, and the promoter becomes wealthy. We don't talk about those 9 who didn't sleep at night, who sold all they had to pursue a passion, a business passion, to create wealth. Second, the rich are constantly being attacked by saying that, for instance, during COVID, the rich have got richer. Why will they not get richer? Their money, their investments are in the markets. When stock markets rise, the money rises, their wealth increases. But when stock markets fall, should society pay? Should society pay Facebook the loss of $200 billion that happened on one day last week because he has lost $200 billion? No, that's the structure of business. There is risk capital. You don't want to take risk, you take a job. The job of a policymaker, politics, bureaucracy, judiciary, the state, is to ensure that wealth continues to be made. Okay, the rich make a lot of money, but they pay more taxes. What is the problem here? I don't see why we are unable to or unwilling to see the virtuous cycle of wealth and keep focusing only on the negatives of wealth. There will be inequality. To remove inequality, you need jobs. The moment that there is an ecosystem that says, come, the state is here to help you, the legal infrastructure is here to help you, put your money, and each person will hire 10, 20, 100,000 people, inequality will go. If you want to continue to stay small, you mentioned another thing, that small businesses versus large businesses. Fine, there is a great virtue in talking about MSMEs, there is a great virtue in talking about small. But do you know, the Minimum Wage Act doesn't apply to small. The Factories Act does not apply to small. The restrictions that are placed on large do not apply to small. The fires that happen in home plastic, which keep happening in Delhi, some plastic maker, hasn't taken safety precautions, and the factory goes up in flames, and the whole area is in flames. That those safeguards aren't there. Is that the growth we want? No, we don't want that growth. What we want is a growth for all. Yes, like Manish mentioned, and the paper has said, there have to be criminal clauses in certain areas. But we cannot have a differentiator saying that if you are small, you are free to burden yourself on the environment. You are free to not pay the labor minimum wage. While if you are big, you pay double, triple, the workers can organize themselves. That can't happen. I think we need to re-examine the debate of inequality within an India context, where we have so many poor. I mean, talking about inequality in Germany, talking about inequality in Norway, France, is a very different kind of literature than talking about inequality in India. Yes, there is inequality. And those ridiculous statistics that come every year, X percentage of people have Y percentage of wealth, etc., is there. But when the stock markets tank, where does that wealth go? That wealth disappears. So I think we need to re-look at inequality, and if we want to go forward, ensure that inequality is removed by more business, more jobs, rather than by penalizing the wealth creators.
Okay. So, in terms of, well, there are policies for wealth creation, then there's, of course, policies for the wealth distribution, which means the whole, how government spending, development spending, etc. And those are two separate things. So if and that is one explanation for growing inequality. And I think that does concern people like me especially against the pandemic. So I think we can't dismiss that part, but that is not within the purview of what we are discussing. We are talking about inequality in regulatory burden within the corporate sector, which means amongst firms. Do you think that, going to Manisha's point of regulatory burden not disproportionately being a burden for small scale versus large scale? Rishi?
So, Shamika, I would actually dissect the problem at a micro level and a small level. So anybody who's having a head count under a certain number, and you can assume between 10 and 20, 10 is where the ESI starts and 20 is where the PF starts. All of those enterprises are informal. And there is hardly any compliance burden, right from PAN number to GST number, you name it. There are no filings, there are no returns, there are no minimum wages requirements. So India already has a ecosystem to support those micro entrepreneurs who cannot bear the burden of compliance. But once they become formal, suddenly that whole burden shoots up. Now, if you look at the ecosystem today, larger enterprises have an army of compliance professionals. Smaller don't. Until you tweak the law, the smaller is becoming the victim of the inspector Raj that we have. So inequality is there today because disproportionate power has been given in the hands of inspectors. So I think that's where we need to look at this. It's not weighed in favor of the corporates or in favor of the MSMEs. Both of them have their own problems. The disproportionate number of micro enterprises in India struggle, and especially in periods of COVID, when they don't have access to capital, access to technology, talent, access to global markets, they die a natural death. At least 40 to 50% of restaurants don't exist anymore that existed pre-COVID time. So I think we need to keep some of these things in view and not look at compliance only for the large one and small ones. I think those differences are already there, but they are not helping our 63 million enterprises to become formal and more productive.
Great. Manish?
I think that Norway, Sweden, and Finland are 2, 3, and 4 of percentage of taxes of GDP. But they are also 4, 5, and 6 in ease of doing business. So I think that's really where we're all coming from. A modern state is a welfare state. The state is better at doing redistribution, but 100% of zero is zero, right? I mean, if we're going to be stuck at 18% of taxes as a percentage of GDP, we're not going to be able to build a modern welfare state. I think the two most important decisions a child in India makes are to choose your parents wisely and your PIN code wisely. Everybody on this call did that. But I think there are ways to change that ovarian lottery. I think that a country, I have watched with envy as China has moved 700 million people from farm to non-farm employment over the last 40 years. That's not cultural. That is just they put in the plumbing, they attracted the investment, they made China an easy place for job creators to create jobs. So finally, a big criticism of this budget is it hasn't put money in the hands of the poor. I mean, budgets don't put money in the hands of the poor. Well-paid jobs do, salaries do. So I think that my case would be that poverty kills, inequality doesn't. Inequality is a good objective. I think we should always keep our eye on inequality, but more important is median household income rather than mean household income. We our disease is poverty. We don't have a shortage of land, labor, capital, but we have a shortage of the fourth factor of production, which is entrepreneurship or innovation. How land, labor, capital combine, and how land, labor, capital combine is influenced by the regulatory regime. And I think it is particularly influenced by the criminalization of trivial offenses. This is about the dog that didn't bark. This is about the corruption that will never show up in formal research. But we must acknowledge that if this was harmless, then why isn't India rich? I mean, the regulatory cholesterol is showing up in our employer profile, where most of them are informal, most of them don't have capital, most don't grow. We have an overwhelming number of dwarfs rather than babies in India, and that's not for the proclivity of India as for dwarfs. We are happy to produce babies, but life is difficult for entrepreneurs.
And growth is difficult. Now, here's a very interesting question from Dr. Firdaus Ahmed Malik. He's basically talking about now inequality across regions and states. As the report highlights, very, very an important point, which is that there are many of these laws which are within the purview of the union government, the center, but actually a majority of them sit with the states. Now, are you concerned? And again, I'll come to each of you. Aniti, I'll start with you this time. Do you think the way the laws exist today and the way the states are implementing or reforming, you are likely to see growing disparity across states and regions in the country?
Shamika, we're already suffering with that problem, and I think that was the thinking in the policymakers that Niti Aayog started talking about cooperative federalism and competitive federalism. So this is something which is not news, which is not something which we have to still witness, still read there. It's a very interesting to just share with you something here, not related to what Gotham has done, but CCS did a great job of identifying some laws in different states, and there was a law in Telangana that punished eunuchs for dressing up gaudily, which was done away with just a few years back by court order. And there's also a law that said that, a commissioner, licensing officer will identify whether it's a sterile bull. And, in case you don't get your bulls registered, there's a punishment for that. And we're talking about Karnataka Livestock Act here. So there are several laws that has existed in a statute book. I think the fundamental thing that we need to think about is how we make policy. Somewhere the whole thinking about policy making has to be reimagined, and we have to consult stakeholders. Today, at least in past, policies have been made top down without due consultation, which has yielded to what the problem that we're facing today. States have to, all the national law commission, there's a national law commission, then there's also state law commissions. State law commissions in all the states have been very inactive. I mean, I don't know why is this not being talked about. How do states make good laws if the state law commissions are not active? They're not discussing. There's no good debate happening in these state assemblies. So this is a grave problem, and I think this needs a very deeper thinking by the states. Inequalities already exist. It's not news for us. We need to now find ways how to remove and build the gap that's there between the states.
Thank you, Niti. We really have come to almost the end, but I do want to give 30 seconds each to both the authors on your just concluding remarks. Gautam?
30 seconds and your tyranny begins again, Shamika. Okay, how can I capture this? I think you mentioned this question, you asked this question earlier, and now when I rethink about it, I think here is what I think. I think we were mad to start this project. We didn't know where it would take us. When this research was being done, when we started it, we didn't know the mind of the government. It was a dark room, dark research room that we entered. But curiously, and just a few days before its release, we know that the government is working to fix this problem. You mentioned the budget, I'll come to that. In his reply to the motion of thanks, Prime Minister said, and I quote, let me just get that quote. We have finished 25,000 compliances. I urge the state governments to hunt for and end such compliance. He said this in Lok Sabha. On budget day, Nirmala Sitharaman had said, in recent years, over 25,000 compliances were reduced and 1,486 union laws were repealed. I think our madness has worked. I see the intent for change. I sense that the government will take note of this report, not just the union government, governments across. A small aside here, you mentioned state and union laws. Many of these laws have been, the master law is the union law, and the rules are in states. So each state has devised rules according to a master law, so that, just to clarify, so if you change the master law in the union level, down the line, many of the changes will happen. Having said that, the states themselves have enacted certain other laws which need change. And I think that change is in the air. And my sense is that this paper gives various governments, policymakers, scholars, thinkers, business people, a hard data and strong arguments, including some causalities that ensure that India begins to start these reforms. We believe that what the Statement of Industrial Policy 1991 did in opening up the economy, compliance reforms, if they begin now, will do as the last mile.
Excellent. Thank you. Rishi?
So, Shamika, we've made 10 major policy recommendations and 31 minor recommendations, and I think at least 4 of them can be done very easily. And all of them will help refine the government's agenda and intent to improve ease of doing business. And I definitely think our data-driven approach on this paper is going to provide some actionable input. And we're happy to work with whoever wants to take this endeavor forward and help India reach its logical destiny of $10 trillion.
Excellent. Manish, your 30 seconds. Famous last words. You are on mute.
No, I've said everything I want. It's just, this is just the beginning, as they say, ibtada, right? I mean, this report that they've put out, hopefully, would lead to a lot more questioning of some of its recommendations, some of the data. I mean, this is just the beginning of putting it out in public debate, but it's a wonderful start, and I just hope that people recognize the direct connectivity between this, economic development, poverty reduction, and job creation.
Sure. Thank you. Niti?
I think we all have, I've said what I had to. Once again, congratulations to Gautam and Rishi for the wonderful report that you produced. And I think this is just the starting point of the discussion. And we have miles to go before we sleep. Thank you.
Thank you, Niti. So, jail for doing business. I urge you all to read the text. I have found it extremely fascinating. But remember, doing research is where our job ends. I think eventually the ownership of these ideas must be propagated. I think it's beyond policymakers. I really urge people in media, I urge the student community and academics to pick up a copy of this. And also do please write in. I think the authors will be more than happy to hear from you. Also possible ways of writing volume number 2 in the future. But this excessive criminalization is holding our potential back. It's a young country. It's an aspirational country. There are many things we can do and do quickly to get back on that path. So I think this is an exceptionally impactful effort from both of you, Rishi and Gautam. Congratulations once again. And thank you all, Manish and Neeti, for joining us. And thank you all for joining us in this discussion. Namaskar.
Thank you.